It's my colleague David Cobb. We both work with a group called Democracy Unlimited of Humboldt County. And we are a grassroots organizing group there in Humboldt. We are based out of Eureka, but we do work all across the county. And we are basically interested in trying out new strategies, coming up with ways to organize our community to challenge corporate rule. We consider ourselves nonviolent revolutionaries. Part of what we'll share with you today is sort of the history behind why we think revolution is an important idea. And tomorrow we'll also be doing another session, which is a little bit more about the strategy of how to be a revolutionary today. So I hope that by the end of the conference, calling yourself a revolutionary may be something that you will think of doing if you haven't already considered that already. So the goal of this session today is to basically give you some history behind corporate rule. And by corporate rule, we mean, David Zolnit talked a little bit today about that sort of corporate global system that seems to be linking, and I am going to adjust the mic that just fell down my shirt. So, the global system linking the economic crisis, war, and the environmental crisis. Our corporate rule is our name for that system. We think that it is sort of a system that involves both corporations and governments that rule over us rather than we the people ruling ourselves. So we want to give you a little bit of history because we think if we're going to uproot that system, if we're going to come up with the strategies to challenge that, if we're going to tell new stories, then we need to know the story of how we have this system of corporate rule today and what its role is in encouraging militarism and war. So David's going to kick it off with sharing the first bit of that history. I'll go with that. We'll do a little group discussion towards the end. So.
Right on. Thank you, Megan. So Megan used the phrase corporate rule. How many people have actually heard that particular phrase? Better raise your hand, David. Oh, man, I love it when I see hands go up, because so often the word in the sort of sanitized corporate media, if they're ever going to talk about the atrocious, racist, destructive practices that these mechanisms, these institutions called corporations do, we hear corporate power, right? But we at Democracy Unlimited and a growing democracy movement in this country, I think, and certainly in the global South, have been using the phrase corporate rule in order to capture the fact that corporations and unelected and unaccountable corporate CEOs are not merely exercising power. They are ruling us. As surely as masters rule slaves or kings rule subjects, unelected and unaccountable corporate CEOs are ruling us. I say that because they are making the fundamental public policy decisions that affect and impact all of our lives. We, in this society, are left with the idea that we can choose as a consumer to exercise power. We can go and pull a lever at elections every 2 or 4 years, as if that anemic display is actually going to change the world. Like, those are the choices where we're supposed to be able to exercise power, but when the real decisions about how our society operates, the real decisions about how resources are allocated or made, they are not made in real public processes. So one of the concepts that I really want to underscore is the difference between the private and the public. Because, for example, how many people here are eating genetically modified foods? Raise your hands. Yeah, see, so y'all spoiled the punchline. You all know we're all eating genetically modified foods, right? You can't help it. But here's a question. How many of you actually participated in your local citizen assemblies and the participatory processes by which the public decision about our public food supply, it was made where we were going to allow these genetically mutated organisms into our food supply? How many of you participated in those? Yeah, see? Trick question, right? Because there weren't any. But let's cut to the chase. Not only were there not an actual participatory process where we all engaged in, but the reality is our elected officials didn't even make those decisions. Who made the decision to put genetically mutated organisms into the public food supply? Specific corporations. Let's name them. The Monsanto Corporation. Archer-Daniels-Midland Corporation, Pioneer Hybrid Corporation. I mean, the reality, and this is what really chaps my ass, they make these public decisions behind closed doors. They claim that they are making a private decision, and we the people are not only, do we not have an opportunity to participate in making the decision, we don't even know the decision's being made until it's presented to us as a de facto reality, and then we've been trained by our society to accept the sanctity of private property rights, to accept the fact that this is the reality, and then whatever response we may have, is to, I don't know, label it or not. Well, what if we actually took our blinders off and said, well, what about the fundamental ruling decisions about whether this should happen or not? That would be a different way. That would be a way of getting outside of the box of what is typically considered acceptable or not acceptable. Now, so how did it come to pass? In a nutshell, in literally like 5 minutes, I'm going to try to give the grand scope. So corporations they're just institutions and mechanisms that have actually always been part of militarism. They've always been part of colonialism. The reality is that what we today think of as the transnational corporation, that entity was birthed in the 13th, 14th, and 15th century of Europe. That era of time is also described as something else, at least in sanitized history textbooks, right? It's the age of discovery. We have to put the discovery in quotation marks, right? It's because it's not the age of discovery. How horrifically, what a perfect example of colonizing our own minds to train us and teach us to think about that era as an age of discovery. It was an age of rape and empire and pillage and plunder and theft. It was not an age of discovery. There were people living in North and South America and Africa. They were not lost. They did not need to be found. There were rich, vibrant civilizations that were already there. So I'm asking you, in terms of storytelling, to actually think about the fact that from our earliest childhood, how we think about history, the story that we've been told has basically been a lie. It has been a lie to train us to take our proper role in a corporate capitalist state and to have the proper deference towards these institutions, not only of corporations, but the entire social, political, and economic system in which we're living in. Because I'm going to cut to the chase and let you know we're living in the Matrix. If you've seen that film, get ready for the red pill. Go ahead and take it. Get ready. Things are as bad as you have always thought that they were. They are just that bad, but they're also just that hopeful. You too can be Neo. Right? You totally can, and you will find that there are many others who are unplugging from this system, the corporate capitalist system. So corporations were actually created 13th, 14th, 15th century Europe in order to concentrate wealth, power, and decision. The reason that they came in that era was to allow the monarchs to actually rape, pillage, and plunder the rest of the land. Let's just arbitrarily say, if this is the whole world, if you are the global South, just because you happen to sit on the right side, you get to be the aristocracy of Europe. Unfortunately, we've got some women, so if we had time, I'd actually make you move over there. Many people, men of color. So what I'd say is, all right, the men over here, you get to be the aristocrats. And in order to create the first corporation, I'll be the king. Why? Because I'm in the front of the room. Now, in the 14th century, I would say, because I am actually God's representative on earth. My legitimacy comes from friggin' God. You really don't get more legitimate than that. If you really and genuinely believe me when I tell you that I am God's representative on earth, and that's the culture that you've been brought up into, and that's the reality that you react to, of course you're going to be deferential to me, right? And in fact, the fact that you're all sitting and I'm standing is pretty good, but to really get this, I should actually be more like this. Yeah, this feels a little bit more like sovereignty now. Now, so that's my kind of power as the king. And really, if I wasn't attached to this, I'd love to just sort of walk amongst you so that you could really get a sense of my power and how much more important I am than you as the king and the sovereign, the rule maker, because that's what sovereignty means, who has the authority, the decision-making authority. So now I've got this problem, though. I want to go out and rape and pillage the rest of the land, but I can't, even as the king, I can't do it all on my own because the aristocrats of my burgeoning nation state actually have a lot of the resources that I need to do. So in order to effectively do it, I say, okay, aristocrats, I'm going to create a new thing under law. The first time it'll be called the Royal Crown Charter, or the first corporation. And what we'll do is you will all invest in this new legal entity that I'm going to create. We will go out, we will rape, pillage, and plunder the wealth of the rest of the world. We'll take the resources back here, and we'll split it amongst ourselves. You'll have to put up the money, and I'll get a percentage of it. Why? Why do I get the percentage? I like how you think, Cindy. You have totally just figured it out. You know, there's another way to think about the corporation, really. It's a bookie arrangement, right? It's full on, like totally gangster stuff when you think of it that way, right? Like, we're going to form a mob. We're going to go and militarily conquer the rest of the world. We're going to take it, and we're going to come and split it up. And because I'm the head of this gang, you know, I get a cut even though I'm using your money. Literally, y'all, that is the formation of the first corporations. The East India Company, the Africa Trading Company. Anybody want to hazard a guess what the Africa Trading Company traded? And, you know, David, instead of just slaves, I actually, let's put a finer point on it. Human beings, right? You know, because I think that we really need to actually, bust through, because it's hard for us today to even wrap our heads around the depravity of actually human bondage, the idea of owning another human being. I hope at least our culture has moved past the idea that we can think about that in a legitimate way. You know, there are a lot of people in the animal rights movement who are making that very argument, David, and who are actually trying to equate it and make the animal rights movement follow in the footsteps of the early abolition movement. And to me, I think that's a fantastic example of learning from successful social movements in history and moving towards it. So the creation of this corporation, right, in order to conquer the rest of the world, it's really interesting because if you take a look at the documents of the folks who actually went out and conquered the rest of the world, when they did it in Africa, it was easily justified, at least in their minds, right? Because they didn't look like them, you know, skin color is different. They had civilization, but it was different than European civilization. What's really interesting, when they get to India, the royal governments of the East India Company, I'm going to say that again, the government of the corporation, when they were reporting back to Parliament, they said, you know, we can't merely conquer these people militarily because they have existing civilizations and institutions. Now, Africa had them too, but they looked different. When they got to India, they had to admit that it looked virtually the same as their own institutions. So the royal crown governors of their day wrote back and said, to properly do our job, which is to vacuum out these resources, we must conquer them militarily and intellectually. We must destroy their existing institutions and make them dependent upon proper British institutions. So they were very clear and explicit. The role of the corporation was military conquest in the physical realm, but in addition, to conquer the minds, to conquer the way that the new subjects thought, to destroy their own history, their own understanding of, because think about it, folks, these civilizations were already getting their needs met, right? I mean, and there was a danger in what we now think of as corporate globalization. In its original sort of impetus, they were very explicit and clear. We have got to destroy indigenous ways of life. Subsistence reality must be destroyed, and we must make them dependent upon, I'll say the words, a new world order. And that was literally what it was about. Fast forward now to the United States of America. How many colonies in the original formation? 13. Here's a question. How many of those were actually corporations? Actually, 12 of them. One was a land grant, but it was a trick question, Robert. But think about it. The original settling of this country was actually done through the instrument, the mechanism of the corporation. In fact, it wasn't originally, Virginia was not originally the Commonwealth. It was the Virginia Company. Georgia was a penal corporation. I mean, we could go down the list, and each one of these corporations, the charter that created it, was done in order to, quote, plant, rule, and govern in the name of the king. So I, as the king, give you the ability to rule these people in America, the new land. You'll do it in my name. I'll continue to actually get profits. The East India Company, by the way, and this is what's really interesting about the history, the East India Company actually had a larger army than the Royal Navy to begin with. So the fusion between the corporation and the military happened literally from the beginning of the creation of the corporation. In fact, to fast forward a little bit, no less an authority on fascism than Benito Mussolini said, you know, fascism should more properly be called corporatism because it is the fusion of the military might of the state with the economic might of the private corporation. And he was lauding it, just to be clear, right? Like, this is something to celebrate and to be good and to recognize how fantastic it is. So in the formation of the first of this very country, and let's just be clear, the founding of this country. So I want to be really explicit about this. The idea that the American colonists rejected the idea of the hereditary might of the king and the sovereignty of a monarch, that's a good thing, right? But let's not get all bent out of shape about it because, you know, this idea that we're going to reject the king. And by the way, the Declaration of Independence, it's really interesting. You know, it starts when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands that have heretofore connected them. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all people, don't do that, are created with certain inalienable rights. I mean, that's powerful rhetoric. And it's something that we should really acknowledge. If you go through the whole list of the Declaration of Independence, it's mostly a list of grievances against the king. That's how they actually write them out. But if you look at them grievance by grievance, quartering soldiers without permission, taking our property without just compensation. You go down the list of grievances, they're really a list of grievances against the royal governors who were governing in the name of the king. I guess what I'm trying to say, a story I'm trying to tell you to think about the American Revolution itself, it's not merely a rejection of monarchy as a form of rule. It is a form of people's uprising against corporate rule. I mean, come on, man. The Boston Tea Party? That's direct action, baby. And yes, it's property destruction. Millions of dollars in today's dollars of empire or imperial tea is dumped into the harbor. And today it's celebrated. Well, why don't we start to think that way as well? The point is that the American Revolution really is an example of people resisting illegitimate authority, in this case, the illegitimate authority of the king. But before I get any further, I have to stop myself, because if we're going to reject monarchy as the legitimate ruler, what are we taught in this country? Who actually now are the rulers?
Corporation. The people.
That's the short answer. But who are we taught to believe? The people. The people are supposed to rule. I mean, that's what we're taught in like 6th grade, right? But the reason I have to stop is because as much as I would like to tell the rah-rah success story of the American Revolution, in 1787, when the Constitution is drafted, or 1789, who are the people? Say it again. Rich white men. And if we really wanted to get down to it, in order to actually have legal rights and assert them under law, you actually had to be the right religion, you had to be the right age, you had to have enough property. It was not just a little bit of property. So we can't really talk about the wonder and the beauty of the American Revolution without understanding it's really a founding violence in this country. The creation of this country is a founding violence, obviously against the indigenous here who were subject to genocidal policies of colonial conquest. But it's also a founding violence, obviously, against the Africans who were brought in chains. It's a founding violence against women, all women, even rich women, because they don't get to be part of the people who have legal rights. It's a founding violence actually against most men, too. White men, even, because most white men in those original 13 colonies were not legally persons who could assert rights under law, because most of them actually were indentured servants, which was just a form of slow motion slavery itself. So I'm telling this big story only to, here is the condensed version. What David Cobb said in his first 15 minutes was, the corporation was created by the ruling elite 5 centuries ago in order to legitimize, legally, under law, the concentration of wealth, power, and decision-making authority, period. That is what corporations were created to do. So frankly, it does not surprise me today that that is what they continue to do. There's a veneer of niceness, or a kinder, gentler fascism, perhaps. But the reality is, in today's world, that's actually what we're dealing with. And so I'm going to stop now because I just want to, and I promise you, it doesn't end there. But my task was to try to paint sort of the big picture history of what is the corporation, how was it actually used, what are the connections between militarism and colonization process. But we're going to spend the rest of our time together actually busting through that and creating the world that we do want. Megan.
Right. Well, and first I want to talk a little bit about, David talked about sort of the age of discovery, right? The process of colonization by which corporations as a military power went abroad and colonized many areas. But colonization continues here in the US. And we have to also live up to the fact that, probably many of the ancestors that many of us had were colonizers themselves, violently pushing people off their land, violently bringing other people in to usurp their labor power, to create the sort of industrial wealth that would eventually be the US. All of those things were happening as we continued to be a colonizing and colonized society here in the US. But I want to stop, and David started talking about the Constitution, and I want to talk a little bit more about that because it is sort of it is the founding document that structures a lot of the relationships between the different social groups, including corporations and people and the government in our society. And it's a very useful thing to think about as we think about how corporations continue to consolidate their ability to rule us throughout US history. So if we think about the structure of the Constitution, I'll write this up here, roughly there are 2 actors in the Constitution. There's we the people and sort of the government. And as David said, the people, pretty small fraction of the folks. It's going to get bigger as we go out through U.S. history, and a lot of our history is about people wedging themselves into this, and this, the people expanding. But so we, the people, we are private sovereign citizens who have the ability to rule over the government, who is the public entity. Sovereignty is not here with the government. The king no longer has sovereignty. Sovereignty is over here with we, the people, and we govern over the public government, who has duties to us. We put duties are sort of with the government, and we have rights. We as people have rights. So here's a question for you. Where are corporations in the Constitution when it's first written? They're not there. A little bit of a trick question. Again, they're not there. They're not addressed. But there's the people in the government. The corporations aren't there, in part because the American Revolution is a recognition of corporate rule and a rejection of that. And corporations are kept on a very short leash immediately after the revolution. They are not chartered at the federal level, they're chartered at the state level. So what that means is the charter is the governing document of a corporation, and it's given by a state legislature saying, here, we are incorporating you, we are giving body to you, this organization, to do business here in our state. But we recognize that it's a big privilege to be able to do that because we know that corporations have taken all sorts of extravagant actions with the ability to be incorporated, to bring money together in this form, to do business. So we want you to recognize that it's a very powerful form, and we're going to put all sorts of limitations on how you can use that power. We, the state legislature, the representatives of the people, are going to say, you can only do business for, say, 10 years. Because you don't need to do business longer than that. We're hiring you to do a specific thing, to build a bridge. You take 10 years to build us a bridge, we're kind of, that's a little bit too long anyhow. So, we're going to also put caps on how much profit you can make in what you do. We're going to put limits on what types of business you can do. You are doing one thing. You cannot build a bridge and then turn around and become a hedge fund, an investment company, a bank, and also market shoes. You cannot do all those things together. That's too much power for one organization. So there were lots of limitations on the corporation right after the revolution. So if the corporation is anywhere sort of in this understanding of the Constitution, it's maybe here. The idea is that it's supposed to be doing something for the good of the people, producing a public good, serving as a bank because people need some sort of ability to do transactions, trade money, things like that. Building a public road, maybe serving as the police or fire force for a community. It's a semi-public good. But of course, the folks who experienced all the power of the corporation were not satisfied with these limitations on what they were doing, so they fought back against that. And as we move through the 19th century, we begin to see the corporation gaining greater and greater rights and greater leeway in what they do as we go through the 19th century. So all of those limitations that I just mentioned, the corporation tries to find ways to not have that, or we should be more specific, the people running the corporations. So we don't necessarily think of them as CEOs at that time, but the CEOs of the time are filing lawsuits to try and get things like these limitations taken away. They successfully get the Supreme Court to rule that a corporate charter, this document that puts the legislature over the corporation, it's not a charter. It's actually more like a contract, so that the corporation and the legislature are more on the same level in negotiating with one another, because a contract has a very different status in our law than a charter does. And they successfully get the Supreme Court to rule that. And the states themselves also began to take away these limitations in order to get more business, the sort of race to the bottom that you hear about, the same race that we face today when people are taking away environmental regulations so that businesses will come do their business in our states. It's a race to the bottom in order to get corporations to come in, when really that race to the bottom, it is to the bottom. It's only taking away measures that in fact protect us. So as we're going through the 19th century and the corporations are becoming a more powerful entity once again, what else is happening in US history? Can folks throw out things? We're talking about like the 1840s, 1850s. Does anybody know what's going on that period of time? It's starting. Territorial expansion. So was there no other thing back there? Look, I heard. So gold rush. So what we have is we have expansion. We have a continued process of colonization going on, except we're going westward, and our government is engaging in wars like the Mexican-American War as the prelude to the Civil War to gain territory, to continue to gain new resources. We're doing things. The gold rush, it is an accumulation of more territory, more resources, and then a forced extraction of those resources from the people to whom they originally belonged. And at the same time, we also have slavery still going on, a crazy multi-leveled process of colonization. I mean, we've kicked people off their land, we put plantations on them, we bring in another labor force, and then pull out the resource of their human labor, in order to produce various goods that can then be shipped all over the world by some of the major corporations who were not necessarily chartered in the US at the time, but the big sugar corporations, cotton corporations, are all taking part of that system that sort of helps build the US economy.
I told you it was the Matrix.
Eventually, we do. We get to the Civil War, and thank you for bringing that up, because that's a really important point. It's one of the points in which the people gets a major expansion after the Civil War, right? We have the passage of the 14th Amendment as the result of that, and that's a really important thing. Black men are given, they're officially established as people. They get to be recognized as people. But the corporation also uses, the form of the corporation also becomes much greater during that period of time. When we think of war profiteering, that was happening all over the place during the Civil War. We had, industrial manufacturers playing the North and the South off one another to get better prices on their good. Often soldiers in the war suffering because of those things, because of poorly made, poorly manufactured goods. Those same things that we think of as happening today, elsewhere, across seas, happening here in the US. The Civil War ends, right? The corporation is kind of, a lot of the companies are very flush from all of the money that they've earned from the war. And they're able to sort of begin waging legal battles to expand their power even more than they already have. I mentioned the 14th Amendment. as a very important thing. And it is what gives sort of the status of persons to many citizens in our country. And the status of personhood is important because it gives access to all of the rights that are guaranteed in the Constitution. You as a person can take things to court because you have a right to have, a certain set of rights upheld by the courts. And right after the Civil War, corporations start bringing suits to the Supreme Court, to lower levels as well, saying that status of person, that thing with all those rights attached, we think we like that, and we would like to have it. We know you said that it was really designed for black men specifically, and you ruled that women can't have it. But we think the women aren't so important, but really corporations, we're people, and we would like that string of rights. And the courts for a long time say no, that's ridiculous, we're not going to do that. But then in 1886, in a case called Southern Pacific Railroad versus the Santa Clara County, the courts kind of beforehand, the Supreme Court justice is like, so this has been a question that's floating around. Are corporations people? Do they have rights? For the purpose of this case, we're just going to say that, yeah, we think that's true. They do. And he establishes a precedent that gets picked up, and it's used later on, and it's expanded in many other cases so that corporations have what is called legal personhood. They have the ability to go into the courts and say, my rights are violated. My rights as a person are violated. And they begin to win all sorts of concessions, all sorts of our rights as actual human beings are eroded because a corporation can come in and say, well, this person who is working for me has violated my private property rights by not giving me as much of their labor. Things like that, all sorts of rights are put for the corporation. And what this effectively does, this model of the Constitution in which the people are over here governing over the government and to some extent corporations, when the corporation moves over here as a person, it effectively makes this document void because no longer are we the people ruling over these public institutions, but rather corporations are here. They're on the side of sovereignty, they're on the side of rights, and they get to make these ruling decisions over our government. And as US history progresses, that only increases. They begin winning all sorts of the rights in the Bill of Rights that we have. So the right to free speech, the right to freedom from search and seizure in the Fourth Amendment. So the reason that workers lack many of the protections that they might have is because a corporation can say, you can't come on to this property without a warrant. So maybe the rights of workers are being violated in all sorts of ways. We can't send people in to look without a warrant, even though those are actual human beings inside that factory, that workplace. So if we actually are interested in this sort of model in which we are making the ruling decisions, corporate personhood is a major issue that we need to address in the Concord. And we'd really like to encourage you to come to the session that we're doing tomorrow, because we're going to talk about ordinances that we have helped pass at the local level as Democracy Unlimited and other things that people are working on all across the country that address sort of the issue of corporate personhood. I want to talk about a couple of other issues, though. So connecting the idea of colonization, which David talked about, with this form of the corporation as it develops in the US, to talk about the way that colonization continues to happen in our society, the way in which it continues to encourage militarism, and the way in which our society today, and we should understand this, is a colonized and colonizing society. It's a continuous process. What we have now, the way the structures in which we move and live and work, the way they are set up, is the result of a colonized process, or a colonization process. And if we are going to challenge and uproot the oppressive systems in which we live, then we need to think about how to decolonize our minds, the systems, the structures in which we live and work. So we think of colonization, and I think it's important to recognize that we do have a period in which colonization appears as this process of going across the water, but it's not just other governments coming over here. It's not just our government going over there. Colonization is not just happening in Iraq. It is happening right here, right now, today, in our minds, in where we live. It is a process of theft continuously ongoing that we all are a part of, right? That we are all having things stolen from us, whether it's our right to rule, whether it's our rights in our workplace, whether it's actually the resources that should belong to all of us together communally, whether it's our clean air being stolen, whether it's our water underneath our ground, as many corporations are just tapping into public aquifers to bottle and sell that water. It is a process that's happening right now. And I think when we think of militarism and corporate colonization, I want us to not think of things that are happening elsewhere or of past processes in which it happened on US soil, but it's now over. I don't just want us to think of Blackwater in Iraq or any oil corporations that are overseas. I want us to think about what is happening in our own communities with what corporations have done historically and continue to do. I think when we think of war profiteering and colonization, we should think of things like the Ludlow Massacre, which happened in Colorado in 1914. If you are not familiar with Ludlow, 1,200 coal miners out on strike because of the miserable conditions in which they are forced to work. They live in company towns where they're forced to buy their food from a given place. They're forced to pay rent for a certain thing. They're not given sort of, any amount of wage that is nearly satisfactory for that. People are dying because of all sorts of diseases that are catching in the mines. They go out on strike because it's intolerable, right? Of course you should go out on strike if those are the conditions in which you live. And the massacre happens when you've got these 1,200 coal miners camped out in tents, striking, trying to prevent strikebreakers from going in, already fighting off corporate police who are going around in what is known as a death special with a sniper rifle shooting at them. The Colorado National Guard is called in and shoots, just opens fire at this tent city. 20 folks killed, 11 children, who they later found burned underneath a tent that, they tried to escape the shooting by going underneath a tent platform, and they actually burned when that tent caught fire, burned to a crisp. That is corporate colonization in the US, right? The Colorado Iron and Fuel Company partnering together with our state military to open fire on workers to kill children. That is the history of colonization that we have in our country, and it's something that we should recognize, and we should see how it continues to happen in our daily lives right now, because we continue to have state military corporate cooperation against we the people when we fight back against our resources, whether it's our labor or our natural resources being taken from us, whether it's protesters in Seattle against the WTO, having strong police force out there against them with tanks. Many of our police forces do have tanks now, as part of Portland just acquired one. You've got whether it's rubber bullets and gas, all of those military force being used against citizens trying to take back what has been taken from them from corporations. We should be clear, the corporation has been something that it is a tool. It is a tool when it has been contained and had limits put on it that has been a useful thing for us to get things done. And it can be a useful tool, right? Just like any tool can be used for harm or for good. But right now, in its current state, it is a tool for the elite to govern us, essentially, through a very, very violent process. And since we're talking about colonization, and I think the examples that you came up are great, I'd actually like us to break into groups and have a little bit of discussion with one another to pull out some more examples like that, to think about what is colonization right now in the communities that we are living in. So what I would like you all to do, and let me give you the instructions and you can break up, is to get into a group of about 4 people. 3 or 4 would be great for a small discussion. And there's a list of questions. I've actually got them on the back of the board, but let me tell them to you because you may not be able to read that. What you should do in your group is pick an area of society, a sector of society. So that could be education. It could be public resources like water. It could be healthcare, food. Any other sectors? People want to name some off? David's going to write those down. Healthcare, earth, education. We got those. Pick a sector. Penal system. So discipline and justice. We might say justice as a collective good. Pick a sector of society and talk about what does that look like in a colonized society, right? And then once you've talked about that a little bit, think about, well, okay, if it's like that in a colonized society, what is it like in my society right now? And talk about how did it get that way? What was the process? Did it involve violence? Did it involve a corporation? Maybe it didn't. Maybe it's colonized by some other force. And then talk about what would that sector look like if it was uncolonized. And maybe talk about how we get there. So that's a long process. I'll move you through those questions. So I'll give you a reminder about when to switch to the next question. Start with picking a sector and talking about what it looks like if it's colonized. Get into a group of 3 or 4 folks. We're going to talk for about 20 minutes and then come back for some wrap-up conversation.
Now, I'm going to say right on, I'm going to also stop as a trainer and an organizer myself to just sort of point out that one of the reasons that we did this and that we do this at Democracy Unlimited is because we really think we've got to get out of the idea that when you come to something like this, we're the experts up at the top, and we're going to talk, and you take your little notes and so forth. So, honestly, part of that little exercise in and of itself was our attempt to start moving into a more democratic space itself. And I'm wondering, what was the experience like in your small group? The kind of questions that were presented to you, did walking through those, any observations generally? So the back and forth led to more creativity for David. So David liked that part of the interaction. Who did anybody do healthcare? What group did y'all? What did y'all have? Education. So anybody else do education? So share with us any observation about what. So in a nutshell, just pop off. What does a colonized education system look like?
Very restricting, suppressed. Has a whole lot to do with funding and the areas that the taxes come from.
Let me capture some
Yeah,
of
please. That'd be great.
There, even to the food that the children are given. And
Some might say forced to eat.
the truth is not told.
Propaganda. I mean, giving a little running commentary.
Your ability to question is, stifled.
So, the Pledge of Allegiance is required. Right. So, and I'm sorry, brother, I don't know your name.
Randall, sorry.
So Randall just sort of eased me into the next question, because as our sister was describing this, I had a thought about a colonized education system. It kind of sounded like the one I was exposed to. I mean, for human children, the most important things that literally, probably the most important first things that we learn is how to walk and how to talk. Forced curriculums are part of it. And when you get into the public education system as it currently operates, what are the first 2 things that you're taught? Sit down and shut up. See what I mean? It's like when you start to peel this back, at least for me, that process, just going through that, I mean, it is actually kind of hard sometimes to really grapple with and come to accept and know that the education system that I was subjected to, that I actually thought was a good one, and by the way, any public school teacher, thank you for what you do. I genuinely mean that. That's not a personal critique here, but to actually come to terms with the reality that our society is colonized. I am colonized. And that's I'm not trying to say we have to feel sorry for those poor people who eat at McDonald's because they are colonized. I am colonized.
And military recruitment of the high school students.
Right. I mean, it's no surprise, by the way, that they're starting to bring in these Apache attack helicopters to elementary schools now. And the military recruiters are bringing in these really cool military apparatus to let them play with. And video games, right? So, I mean, I guess what I'm saying, we could do that. We've only got about 10, 15 minutes left together as a group. We could go through the criminal justice system. I know that's what y'all were talking about. Any one of these, what we would find is, I suspect, and I'll just assert, they're all colonized. We've been colonized. Our sectors of society have been colonized. So to cut to the chase, then what the hell are we going to do? I mean, really and truly, that's actually, I think, what at the heart of this conference is, how are we going to take collective action? And I'm going to use, like, we only had originally 90 minutes, and then it got condensed to an hour to do what we normally do at Democracy Unlimited in a weekend-long retreat itself. But we at Democracy Unlimited have actually come to the belief that we actually have to have a theory of social change. Much like David sort of lined it out. We have a strategy. I mean, like, and we're open to changing it, and we do, in fact, change it. We certainly change our projects. But in a nutshell, if this is what we're living in, then how can we actually create a new society? I think it has to start by resisting the dominant institution every way that we can. In other words, and honestly, folks, that's the way traditional activism usually operates. You know, we have been trained, like that's what David earlier was talking in his keynote about, like doing the same thing. And at some level, you need to do that. Because by the way, if your house is on fire, do you want a theory of fire suppression throughout world history? Put it out! Help! 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 So if there is a clear cut going on in the forest in which you live, stop it. Stop it. Put your body on the line. And let me say this, anybody who is willing to engage in civil disobedience, to put their body on the line, and who are doing that needs our thanks, they need our love, they need our support, and that has to be done, right? That has to be done. And so I say that, and I applaud it, and I'm so glad that the sisters started the round of applause for that, because I don't want the next thing that I say to be lost. We have to support that, and it's not enough. It's just not enough. Because, even if you win, right? What happens?
Exactly. They cut down another forest somewhere else.
They go someplace else, right? They change the name of the pesticide, right? I mean, say it again? Oh, they definitely will punish you. I mean, remember during the lead up to the Iraq War, sadly there wasn't really that much demonstration going on around the war in Afghanistan, but in Iraq, hundreds of thousands of us in this country were allowed to peacefully march through cities with our banners and our signs and shake our fists at buildings, right? That's all acceptable. A couple of hundred people go down to the port of Oakland to actually try to stop the war machine. What happens, David? Isn't he so sweet? What I might have said if I were in David's position is that the Gestapo comes in with rubber bullets and truncheons and shoots you.
I'm going to update that, and I'm going to say Darth Vader times 2000.
Darth Vader. Look, the Empire Strikes Back, there's a great story. Is there any doubt who is the Empire? No. Are we the Ewoks in this country?
I don't know if you're familiar with local things, but are you familiar with what happened recently with Ian Van Orn?
No.
Locally in Eugene? Yes.
Tell the story.
He was a pesticide protester protesting in downtown Eugene, and he was arrested for misdemeanor offense, basically for blocking traffic. And he was tasered twice while he was laying on the ground with his arms behind his back. And then, throw it back in our face, they gave the cop that tasered him the Officer of the Year award.
Right.
I would say
So I'm going to cut to the chase because I don't want this to I'm going to flip it around a little bit, because what I don't want us to do is end on that kind of we're being oppressed and then the cop gets an award. Because where I live in Humboldt County, many of you may know the story of the nonviolent protesters, mostly young women who had pepper spray put in their eye, and the district attorney actually refused to prosecute. In 4 years with political organizing, with direct action, which that was, and other political organizing, we elected a new district attorney. We fired the son of a bitch who did that. Right? He got fired by the people. And we got a new district attorney in, and one of the first actions of that new district attorney was to file a fraud lawsuit against Maxam Corporation and the Pacific Lumber Company, alleging fraud in timber harvest plans. So the reason I'm doing this is to say, yes, we've got to resist the dominant system, but we've got to flip the script. We've got to change the cultural assumptions around what it is. Go ahead.
Okay, so, and a follow-up on Ian yesterday, how at the Forest Service was needed, they had a 2-hour protest, the Forest Service
And that's, I guess, a takeaway. People before us did not quit. They did not give up. They continued to educate, to agitate, to organize. And I just think of it this way. Every social movement, whenever it's in its nascency and whenever it's first beginning, is clearly doomed to failure. If you were an American revolutionary in the 1750s, you were an idiot. Right? I mean, think about it. This is the most powerful empire the world had ever seen before. And in fact, I used to say that the American revolutionaries were not calling for a more socially responsible king. So we shouldn't call for more socially responsible corporations. We're asking the wrong question. But actually, in the 1750s, you know what the people who became revolutionaries were calling for? A more socially responsible king. Read the language. Letters to the king that go, "O Father King, we, your humble and obedient children, come before you and ask that you intercede on our behalf because Parliament is mistreating us, and we, your obedient children, await your protection." And in one generation, it goes from that obsequious, almost disgusting kind of language to, "King, get out." So to cut to the chase, I am very interested in that generation. What happens, what is it that turns people away from a passive acceptance and actually gets them to act not just differently, but in a way that is actually, if you're sort of being logical and doing a power math, is destined to failure. If you're an abolitionist against slavery in the 1840s, what is your life going to be like? Anybody know history a little bit? You're going to be hounded. Ridiculed. Say it again.
Literally by dogs.
Literally by dogs. Beaten, mocked, ridiculed. If you think that women who in the 1850s actually can't even own property, in fact, they are property, right? If you actually think that they should be allowed to vote, or even more, think that they actually should be equal participants, you are clearly a fool. The entire social, historical construct of what it is to be a woman and what gender is shows that you have no appreciation or understanding of the natural way things are. And I could go through every other social movement. The trade unionists who stood up in Ludlow, every single one of them, it seemed impossible. Yes?
Say the same thing about abolitionists from the animal rights movement today.
Totally, you can say the same thing. Right? Randall is talking about, and what I really appreciate about many in the animal rights and the animal liberation movement is that they are placing themselves intentionally and strategically in a historical arc that says we're going to win. And in another decade, another 20 years, you will look back on the way animals are treated, and you will see the similarities between animal treatment and slavery. Have I done a fair job? I mean, I'm not actually of that movement.
You did okay.
Did okay. For somebody who's not in it. I guess what I'm saying is this. Resisting the dominant system, but we also, that's not enough. We have to create alternatives. David had a shout out, the community currencies, independent business alliances, workers' collectives. We got to meet our needs here and now. And what I really like about it is it doesn't mean that we have to wait for government to do it for us. Do it yourself. DIY. We have really got to get to the point where we start to create these institutions, and they'll start off as little pockets, right? And the trick is to start to connect with other people who are doing it. And I really want to make sure, did we pass the sign-up already?
Do you folks got it? We can pass it.
So I'm going to pass around now a sign-up sheet. If you want to be in connection with Democracy Unlimited and figure out actually the different things that we're doing, because every one of those things that I just described, we're actually doing right now. Here's one just real quick. We live in Eureka, and Humboldt County is traditional Wiyot country. We've started an honor. How many people here are familiar with reparations or were ever part of the movement to try to force reparations for the descendants of slaves? I was part of that effort. And it really frustrated me because it was always about trying to help John Conyers' bill get a reading and then get out of subcommittee. It never worked. We're doing a new strategy now. Only instead of with slaves, because there are less than 1% of the population of where I now live are descendants of slaves or even African American. But there is a vibrant Indian population. So we're paying an honor tax. We're partnering with the Seventh Generation Fund, and we're saying we currently live on traditional Wiyot land. And in order to acknowledge that, start a dialogue on the creation of genocide of Humboldt County in the state of California, we're going to pay a tax to the Wiyot tribe that still exists. It's going to be voluntary, so we don't have to wait for government to do it. It opens up a dialogue, and we are now in conversation with Wiyot people in a way that we had never been before. And and I could go into detail about all that we went through in order to make that happen. But just to share with you that there are so many different ways that we can start to act and think differently that we can't talk about in the 10 minutes that we have for this deconstruction. Margaret Thatcher around corporate globalization is famous for have said TINA. Anybody know what TINA stands for Margaret Thatcher? There is no alternative. TINA. My response, ta-ta. There are thousands of alternatives. There are so many different ways that we can get our needs met. We just have to decolonize our minds. So we create those alternatives. The third thing, very quickly, thank you. We have to start teaching ourselves the kind of organizing strategies that David talked about just a little bit, that you just experienced. I mean, we have a whole series of these that we do at Democracy Unlimited. Exercises and workshops and techniques to start to help decolonize our own minds, and then start to do strategy sessions that move us into the fourth thing, which is shifting the culture. Because at the end of the day, I'm trained as a lawyer, and I've sued the bastards. I have been engaged in nonviolent civil disobedience. I run for office. I was the Green Party candidate for president, an anarchist for president. Yeah. I guess what I'm saying is I've done everything. In fact, when I ran for office, I ran on my record. I ran on my arrest record, right? That was kind of my deal. It's like, how many people here have been to jail for justice? Feels good, right? Yeah. I guess what I'm trying to do is get more and more people to start thinking about themselves in active resistance to this system, and to be very explicit about it. To be very explicit about it, but not merely in resistance, but that we're going to do all of these things kind of at once.